Let's get started weaving using grocery bags with a Kumihimo Disk. You start with a grocery bag, and I fold them in this orientation where you have the handles on the left and the bottom seam on your right, and then you fold handle to handle, seam to seam, and keep folding in that orientation so that when you're cutting, you're making these loops. It's also nice to kind of press them flat. It makes for a cleaner, straighter cut. So you'll remove the bottom part, that's just the seam, and won't make a complete loop. And then you can cut them about a half an inch, an inch. I highly recommend playing around to see what thicknesses work for you. Too thin, however, does mean that you have to be really, really delicate, and in some ways they just kind of stretch out and it's not usable. But you'll really be able to find out the thickness that you like. For this project, I'm just going to be using a strip of this plastic, and so we will cut these loops open, and I won't be elongating them. But in some cases you might want to make a really long piece of Kumihimo cord, and in that case I'm going to show you how to make your strands longer. There are actually two options that I know of, one of which you take one loop and you put the end of a loop through the other loop, and then using your hand, you pull that same side through. So I'm using one color and another color to show you how to do it, but you can obviously do the same colors. You do want to pull delicately. When you pull too hard, it can either sort of stretch it out of its shape or its thickness, or it can tear it. You'll get a hang of it. This might happen to you even if you're really careful. So be patient with yourself. For the other option, I am using an iron to heat the strips, and so I cut the strips to where it's no longer a loop. It's a open strand, and I have this parchment paper. And because we're working on such a small project, I folded the piece of parchment paper in half because you want a sandwich. You always want parchment paper protecting the iron and the mat from the heat. And so I've overlapped these two strands. The distance doesn't really matter, just enough for the two to seal. And with a high-ish heat, you can just barely touch where it's overlapping. You don't have to go through the length of it, and allow it to cool for a couple of seconds, and then you can peel the parchment paper up, and the two strips have a seal. So, like I said, this cord, I'm just using open strands, and I'm doing an 8-strand cord. So I have 4 white strands and 4 gray strands. I'm organizing them to where they'll be kind of somewhat together. I don't know that this is important. And then I'm just tying a simple knot at the very end. Again, you want to pull sort of delicately as you can stretch your material. So you want it to be tight enough to hold, but you don't want to pull so tight that you stretch the plastic. And then this is a Kumihimo Disk. I like to mark which direction I'm turning the loom in, which you'll see later. But these are kind of to help my brain remember stuff as I zone out. Load your loom by putting the knotted end into the middle hole of your Kumihimo Disk. And I'm using these dots to evenly place all of my strands. So you'll keep, for this design, you'll keep them in pairs, and I'm keeping the colors together. So the top two are white, and the bottom two are white, and the left and right have 2 strands each that are gray. And as you're notching them in, the sort of pressure that it takes might, you might sometimes put it in a little too firmly, or and stretch it. So it takes a little bit of practice kind of figuring out just how much tension to place as you're notching them in. And then each design has a different sequence, a different pattern. For this design, we start with the top right strand, and you bring it down to the bottom right and notch it in. And the bottom left, you pull it up and notch it into the top left. And then you turn the whole disc so that now the gray is there. Top right to bottom right, bottom left to top left, and turn. Top right to bottom right, bottom left to top left, and turn. And I literally said this to myself over and over and over again as I was starting, and eventually my hands sort of learned the pattern. And so if you're making a lot of mistakes as you're getting going, be kind to yourself, and know that your hands are catching up, and will soon be a lot quicker than your brain is, or at least in my experience, that's the case. And so I really allow my hands the chance to learn what's going on. So my first ones are always, just kind of playing around. But as you're going, you're remembering to keep the tension, and if the tension is good, then it's loose enough to start kind of growing this cord at the bottom, but tight enough for the strands to really stay in place. And these kind of 2 parallel lines are the ideal look of it. Now this one, these kind of got twisted. They aren't, I don't know, something I did sort of helped twist them, but it's not always the case. And then eventually you get to the end of one of your strands. Not all of them will end at the same time, but that one will kind of let you know it's time to finish. And there are probably a million variations on how to finish this. I end up cutting off the ends and fusing them, and so how I finish doesn't matter as much. You might find a different way works for you. But this really helps me kind of keep the tension so it doesn't unravel while I'm working, and then I can kind of finish it off in a way that works for the project that I'm working on. So you can see the sort of texture and the spiral and the thickness here. I will show a troubleshooting at the end of this video where one of them tore, and how I worked with that. But something that I do is then stretch the whole thing out. So just a light pull, and then it kind of, the strand gets a little bit thinner, and the spiral gets a little bit more visible. I think this naturally happens with other materials, but with this plastic, you kind of have to help it along. And then I trim off anything that needs to be trimmed. So, like I said, there's a troubleshooting part. One of the big things that happens is that I get mixed up on my sequence. And so this might happen a lot in the beginning, but as you get along, you might catch it a little bit quicker. It just looks a little wrong on your loom. And so the best way that I've figured out how to do that is just kind of go backwards and follow kind of the path. So you'll see this one needs to go up and over in order for it to be back in the place that it was. And then once you get this nice parallel line again, you'll then turn it to the left, and that's the next step, and you in your sequence, and you start back on your sequence. So another thing that happens, especially right when you've loaded the loom and the strands are all still really long, is that they get tangled. And I don't, besides maybe bundling them all up, which you can absolutely do, I just end up untangling them as I go. And then one of the big things that happens is the strand tears. And this is really disappointing, but actually not as like ending as everything that it could be. And so I just tie this in like you would tying a shoe, and I make two like a double knot. And then again, remember when you're tying knots to be extra delicate. I have stretched many out when I'm in a rush. And then to do that, I just end up tugging on sort of the opposite ends and then switching to the tails and then doing it again until it feels secure. And then get back on with your sequence. And eventually the knot will sort of move into the cord. So with my finished cord, I ended up making this pair of earrings, but I'm curious, what do you want to make?